All right, so today the guest is Linda Zoe. She's an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Maryland. So Linda, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, so I like to start all of these by just saying most generally, what are the research questions that most guide your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think broadly speaking, I'm really interested in how these kinds of big sociocultural changes to our racial landscape, like increasing immigration and increasing racial diversity, this kind of majority minority shift people keep talking about, how those factors influence how people of different racial and ethnic groups relate to each other.
Okay, so my most common follow-up to that is I say, okay, to me it's self-evident why that's important, but I also like to let the expert kind of weigh in on why do you think it's so important to be studying these issues right now?
Oh, I mean, that's a good question. I'm tempted to say this year it's a little bit self-evident. I think race relations have always been important. This year they've kind of bubbled up to the surface. They clearly shape different groups' outcomes in society, their well-being, the opportunities they're presented with, the constraints that they're presented with. So just in pursuit of racial equity, I think it's important to study these kinds of things.
Yes, well put. Not a controversial question or response. So just to go back to the development of this racial position model, when you were first working on it, or you first even had the idea before any studies were collected, can you take us back to what you were seeing in the existing literature that while it was important and influential, you thought there was this need for an additional perspective?
Yeah, all the way back. I started working on this project my first year of grad school, actually. And what I originally wanted to do was actually look at intra-minority relations. So I was really interested in this idea of how Black Americans and Asian Americans relate to each other and how they kind of perceive each other and might experience conflict with each other. And I was reading in history, political science, and it seemed like these other fields were acknowledging that these are two groups that have kind of been subordinated in the US in like these very kind of qualitatively distinct ways. And then in psychology, one, there was kind of a dearth of literature in terms of intra-minority relations in general. And then there didn't seem to be like a systematic exploration of how different racial and ethnic minority groups are kind of perceived along these distinct dimensions and treated differently along these distinct dimensions. So I guess in order to get to that kind of eventual point where I could look at Black Asian relations, I first had to start a little bit further back and look at, do people stereotype racial and ethnic minority groups along these kind of dimensions of perceived inferiority and perceived cultural foreignness? Do these dimensions shape these different groups' experiences of prejudice and discrimination? And so that's kind of how I got started. Was I wanted to do this thing, I couldn't do it without doing this other thing first, and and it led to this paper.
Interesting. Okay, so I guess I want to jump off of that a little bit. Oftentimes when there are these big new theories that come out, for better or worse, they're very expansive. These are the dimensions that define stereotypes or define discrimination, for example. But yours is actually interestingly narrow. I think that you're very specific to US context and race specifically. So, I mean, I guess, do you feel like these dimensions related to superiority and inferiority, and maybe not even American native, but foreign native, American foreign, but instead of American foreign, native foreign, do you think that those apply to across many different cultures and you just are uncomfortable looking at or uncomfortable speaking about that yet? Or do you actually think that these dimensions are specific to America and race?
I think that's an empirical question. I don't necessarily think they're bound to this kind of American context. I definitely, derive these dimensions theoretically from looking at, historical work within the US national kind of context. But I think they could be more broadly applied. I'm thinking like, these other Western nations that have also been experiencing increased immigration and kind of pushback against those forces, like Canada, Western Europe, Australia. I'm sure there's some kind of dynamic of insider outsider present in those kinds of countries too. Setna, my advisor, studies women's experiences in STEM. And so early on, we kind of thought through this idea of, well, it could maybe also apply to those kinds of contexts where, there's like a very specific prototype of who belongs in a field and who doesn't. Specifically that, STEM fields are kind of modeled after this very masculine prototype. And then so women's experiences in STEM might have this dimension of, your lower status, but then also you don't really belong. You're an outsider within these STEM fields. So we thought about that too. I guess to summarize, I don't know. But
Yeah, okay. So what about religion, for example? Is there a way that you could swap out race for religion and you'd still have these two axes, but they just be represented by different groups? Or do you think that these four quadrants they've developed really specific to race?
I can also imagine religion. Like I can imagine maybe Jewish Americans occupying some kind of position similar to Asian Americans with a relatively high status, also foreign outsider. Or I know Arab American also gets conflated with Muslim a lot. And then so I would imagine maybe they occupy a similar position where they're extremely, extremely foreign. Yeah, I kind of hesitate to say for sure, but
Right, of course, you're being nicely conservative about this. But it does sound like you're not, even if we were to run these studies, it doesn't sound like you think that these are fundamental ways that groups are perceived, but they are very situated in a certain historical conditions, right? There have to be some sort of historical conditions that would need to be met in order for these dimensions to emerge.
Yes, I think, having that kind of history of exclusionary immigration policy probably matters quite a bit for that kind of insider outsider dimension, or at least having this history of having like one dominant group after which this kind of national prototype was modeled after. But like I said, I mean, if you kind of tweak that foreignness dimension a bit, I can also see it applying to gender in specific contexts. I just don't see it as, I don't see it as a super, I don't see it as super kind of expansive, applicable to all groups. Like, for example, I don't think age would really apply. These kinds of groups that are relatively more interdependent, I can't imagine people saying like young people or old people are particularly foreign unless you kind of ground it in a specific context. That's why I don't see it as like really competing with stereotype content model out that much, because I see it as very specific to like, race and ethnic relations.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. To go a little bit into the specific findings, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like the results from study 4, when you broke these groups further down by gender, the patterns didn't really seem to change all that much.
Yeah, that's accurate. So, for example, African American women were still perceived as more low status and inferior than Asian American or white American women. So the relative racial and ethnic group positions kind of stayed consistent. There were a couple of distinctions within racial and ethnic groups. So, for example, within Asian Americans, Asian American women were perceived as lower status than Asian American men.
Okay.
And that was true for white Americans too. White American women were perceived as more low status than white American men. No real differences along the foreignness dimension though. And then within the kind of stereotypically lower status racial and ethnic minority groups, there were also no status related differences among the men and women. So for example, this was a weird one. African American men and African American women were perceived as the same in terms of status, and same with Latinx American men and women and Native American men and women.
I see. So I find that pretty surprising. I mean, for some of the results that you just highlighted, because we know, based on work in intersectionality or SDO, the double Jeopardy hypothesis, or some of the work by Carrie Johnson about how our concepts of race and gender from a perceptive level are very much tied up in each other. So I'm asking you to speculate here. Why do you think that there wasn't such an effect of gender in your results?
Yeah, my kind of instinct, though I don't really know, is that you have this kind of idea of double jeopardy, where you would imagine, racial and ethnic minority women might be perceived as lower status than racial and ethnic minority men. And then you have this other kind of competing hypothesis that within these kinds of lower status racial and ethnic minority groups, it's like the men who are really the targets of racial prejudice and discrimination. And I guess maybe effectively the two sort of wash each other out in my data. That's kind of one possibility. The other possibility is that participants don't really know about, who's low status or who's higher status at the group level. So,
okay, that makes sense. My class at this point has covered a lot about the implicit association test, and I do a lot of work on that. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, have you looked at these same dimensions implicitly? And regardless of whether you have, do you think that the results would come out similarly and there'd be value in doing that?
Yeah, I haven't personally. I know, so Thierry Devos has work that's used that kind of American, not American race IAT. And I believe those patterns are pretty consistent in that, white Americans are like the most associated with this American category, and then African Americans less so, and then Asian Americans even more less so. So that kind of speaks to the foreignness dimension. And then I don't know that there's a status related IAT.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of one. I mean, they're very much tied up in, and most of that work is evaluative attitude. So I can't think of one that's based on status. Do you think that the results would come out similarly to what happens in self-report?
I would guess so, yeah.
Okay, but it doesn't seem like, I agree with you, and that's probably because I haven't done these studies yet, that, it seems like the self-report is what's more interesting here. It's only if you basically couldn't get this in self-report that maybe you'd want to look implicitly, but I agree that I think that they would align, but the self-report seems to be a more compelling story here. So are there current actually, before I get into that, so do you think that the relative positions of these groups, A, could it change over time? And B, do you think it will change over time?
I definitely think they could. I think historically they have. Just thinking about Asian Americans, when they first kind of started immigrating in larger numbers in the 1800s, they were perceived as more low status than they are currently with this whole kind of model minority stereotype. And then along the kind of foreign American dimension, we've seen white ethnic groups assimilate more into the kind of American national identity over time. So I think, these positions are definitely dynamic, and groups' positions could change over time. As for whether they will or not,
you don't have to commit to that if you're not comfortable, but I guess just the idea that they can change over time and they're not necessarily set in stone where they are now. I think historically, if we maybe had these measures, you would have seen a lot more movement, replicating these over time. So maybe, I don't know, you could set a calendar reminder to replicate this every 10 years.
That's actually a really good idea.
Yeah, we could see maybe some shifting over time. I guess going off that question, do you think that do you have current applications of this model that you're really excited about or interested about?
Yeah, I can tell you about what we're currently doing, what I want to do. Right now, we're looking at how these kinds of dimensions play out in terms of labor market discrimination. So Terrence Pope and then Satna at UW. We're looking at how people kind of match racial and ethnic minority job applicants to the specific kind of stereotypes of the job. So if you have for example, job that's stereotypically high status, then you might prefer, Asian Americans who are also stereotyped as relatively high status. But if you have a job that's kind of more relevant to this idea of American identity, maybe it's in politics, maybe it's in government, you might match that kind of job more with a stereotypically American racial and ethnic minority group. And so what we find is that for these kinds of American typed jobs, participants actually are more likely to select a Black job applicant than an Asian job applicant. And then the status ones are a little bit fuzzier right now because people are kind of unwilling to discriminate against the Black job applicant in favor of the Asian job applicant, but it's working out for the American type job.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, go off a little bit of a tangent there, but we also do talk about methods a lot in this class, and it does seem that for many of the reasons you outlined, race is something that people are very aware of when as soon as they step in and they know that they're doing a psychology study. So in my own work, I've also found difficulty in kind of reproducing maybe what we might see in a real world study in a lab context, because people are very, very attuned to the racial dimension. But when you're studying something that maybe they're not so aware of in the moment, like foreignness dimension, then you might see behavior in the lab that aligns with behavior out more in the real world.
Yeah, definitely. So to keep going on this tangent, we have this other project going looking at how acceptable people think it is to kind of stereotype and discriminate against groups based on their perceived inferiority or perceived foreignness. And inferiority is like definitely a no-no. Everyone kind of knows that counts as discrimination. But when it comes to, you know, is it okay to not give this person a job because you think they're a foreigner? It's perceived as a little bit more acceptable, a little bit less kind of discriminatory.
Huh. That's very interesting. I'm surprised by that because, you know, I think most people, they think that any kind of discrimination is like unacceptable when you ask them to report in the moment, but you can actually, I guess what you're saying is that across social dimensions, you can actually get some interesting variability. I guess thinking about that, you know, at times I've adopted measures about motivation to control prejudice, about race. Those are practically at ceiling, but if you swap out race for physical attractiveness, it's still pretty high, but people aren't as bothered by this idea that they might be discriminating based on physical attractiveness.
Yep.
Okay, tangent over. I guess before we go, I want your thoughts on thinking about the field of intergroup relations research in the next 5 or 10 years. What are the questions that you hope we make the most traction on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess to go back to what I was talking about a little earlier, I really want to see more work on intra-minority relations. I think especially as, you know, racial diversity is increasing and these different minority groups are growing larger and having more contact with each other, you know, how are those interactions going? What are some factors that contribute to conflict versus kind of coalition and alliance building? And in particular, when it comes to intra-minority relations, how do non-Black minorities relate to Black Americans, right? Like how might they try to strategically distance themselves from African Americans or try to affiliate themselves with African Americans? So just more intra-minority work that kind of acknowledges the very specific position of Black Americans in US society. More work looking at white identity, so what it means to be white, who counts as white, how this idea of who counts as white might change as we kind of approach this impending majority minority shift that everyone keeps talking about. And I think that'd be really interesting. I think it's interesting how within social psychology, a lot of literature seems to suggest that white Americans kind of tighten their group boundaries under threat. But then there's this other work in sociology looking at how, you know, over time, mixed race individuals, particularly Asian white multiracials and Latinx white multiracials might slowly become more incorporated into this kind of white racial group. So how to, you know, reconcile those two ideas together would be really fascinating, I think. More work on intersectionality. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, those are all very, I think, compelling lines of research. Surely, as demographic changes accelerate, I think in the decades to come, I think it's going to be a really interesting question to see how people redefine their groups or how groups relate to one another. Because, yeah, these changes are definitely coming and they're going to have serious implications for not only the way that we perceive each other, but the way that we behave, kind of policies that people support. So no argument for me that those are worthy questions of study. And you'll just have to come back in 10 years and show us the replication, first of all, of that position model, and then tell us all about the progress we've made on these questions. So, Linda, I really appreciate your time and thank you again for speaking with us.
Thanks.